Welcome, welcome, welcome. My name is Dexter Voisin, and I'm the dean here at the Mandel School, and it's so great to see all of you here in person, as well as all of those who are joining us on the live stream. So we know what we're all here for, to celebrate our Mandel Leadership Fellows. Now, a few factoids that some of you may not be familiar with. Our fellowship program is modeled after adapted Israeli programs supported by the Mandel Foundation. And we want to say a heartfelt thanks to the Mandel Foundation for their generous support of the program. Yeah, someone is clapping. Yes, let's give them a hand. Thank you. Now, our program is now in its 11th year, and it was designed by Dr. David Beagle after extensive community consultation. The first cohort was enrolled in 2012 with 5 students, 5 direct practice students. In 2015, the program expanded to 7 students and included community practice social change students. Now, the Lewis Stokes Fellowship was later folded into the program, and you'll hear also from our Mandel Leaders Fellow, who is also a Lewis Stokes Fellow. Now, the program is simple, clear, and strategic. We identify emerging social work leaders with strong academic records, and many of these folks are coming from the Peace Corps, City Corps, AmeriCorps, just to name a few. So we're looking for the creme de la creme. Many of these students are applying to the top 10 schools of social work across the country. So it's a highly competitive field, and we want to make sure that they land here at the Mandel School. The program has a dual focus on leadership and evidence-based practice. Now, you're here to hear from the fellows, and I'd like to introduce you to Dr. David Hussey, who is the current director of the fellowship program. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Hussey.
Thank you, Dean Voisin, for that warm welcome. Lori Longs-Painter and I direct our 2 fellow programs. Lori directs the Child Welfare Fellows, and I direct the Mandel Leadership Fellows, who are supported by the ongoing generosity of the Mandel Foundation. We also would like to welcome all of you and extend a special welcome to our students, including our former fellows who are able to join us this evening. I ask the fellows who are joining us remotely to please add their names to the chat, and those who are present to please stand so that we could recognize you. The capstone presentations are the culminating learning experience of the students in our fellows program. This evening, we have 8 capstone presentations, 2 from the Child Welfare Fellows and 6 from the Mandel Leadership Fellows. The fellows examine compelling practice issues and typically propose practice-based innovations and solutions. Our fellows represent all of our students, and these capstone projects magnificently illustrate the depth and breadth of social work practice and the early grasp that our students have on advanced practice issues and dilemmas. The capstone projects are typically completed over the course of 1 or 2 semesters and are often conducted with the help of faculty, field supervisors, and our Mandel Leadership Fellows. Several of the mentors are here this evening, so please enter your names in the chat or stand and let us thank you for the wonderful work you do as mentors. Please stand. There are 2 components to this evening's session. The first is a brief, very tightly practiced 6-minute live stream presentation, and then the traditional poster session where attendees get to interact and ask questions of the fellows. In the chat, you will also see contact information for the fellows. Feel free to send them questions or comments, and they'll respond to you after the session, but not this evening, maybe tomorrow or the day after. Now I'd like to introduce our first presenter, Mr. Jesse Bassett.
I think we're looking for a different PowerPoint. There's a clicker. That's me. There we are. Good evening, everybody. The title of my capstone project is Mind and Body, a case for augmenting physical activity in the treatment of PTSD. Post-traumatic stress disorder, also known as PTSD, is a pervasive and debilitating condition that affects approximately 5% of the U.S. population on an annual basis. PTSD is almost never an isolated event. More often than not, a variety of comorbid physical and mental health conditions accompany this diagnosis, including depression, anxiety, substance use disorder, suicidality, chronic pain, metabolic syndrome, cardiovascular disease, and type 2 diabetes. Those diagnosed with PTSD are also more likely to engage in health risk behaviors, including regular smoking, alcohol and drug abuse, and harmful levels of inactivity. Current treatment recommendations for PTSD often emphasize various forms of psychotherapy that utilize cognitive or top-down approaches. While such therapies are widely understood to be effective in the treatment of PTSD, many consumers are left with residual symptoms. In addition, cognitive-based approaches do not treat the aforementioned comorbid health conditions. This project proposes a more holistic and potentially effective approach to the treatment of PTSD by augmenting physical activity with psychotherapy. A growing body of literature shows that by employing body-based or bottom-up approaches to the treatment of trauma, individuals can experience improved outcomes in both mental and physical health. So, what is physical activity and why the use of this term? I was drawn to physical activity with this definition. Physical activity is any bodily movement produced by skeletal muscles that results in energy expenditure. Physical activity is also planned, structured, repetitive, and purposive. These two descriptions capture the spirit and essence of what this project sought to understand. First, whether cultivating bodily movement in an intentional way can aid in the recovery of trauma. And second, what are the parameters to physical activity that will provide this benefit? And it turns out that physical activity can provide a significant benefit in the treatment of PTSD. In reviewing relevant literature, a variety of interventions are effective, including yoga, running, biking, resistance training, dancing, sports, and, if you're lucky enough to live by the ocean, even surfing. Length of interventions ranged from 30 to 60 minutes over a 3 to 12 week period. These interventions were tested as standalone treatments and via augmentation with psychotherapy. Across studies, researchers found consistent benefits from physical activity as an intervention. These benefits include the reduction of symptoms such as arousal and reactivity, avoidance and numbing, and chronic pain. Physical activity also appears to reduce health risk behaviors like smoking and drinking. And physical activity improved cognitions, mood and emotions, sleep quality and duration, health preventative behaviors, and attunement to one's mind and body. So what are the opportunities, limitations, and implications for social work practice? First, research points to physical activity alone, and when in combination with psychotherapy, can reduce symptoms of PTSD and improve overall well-being. In fact, augmenting physical activity with psychotherapy provides greater benefit to consumers compared to psychotherapy alone. Second, it's good news for practitioners and consumers that a variety of activities can provide this benefit. Clinicians and consumers can pull from a large menu of options that fits the consumer's interests, skills, and motivations. Third, frequency, duration, and intensity seem to play an important role in this process. There is a dose-response relationship between the length and intensity of physical activity and the reduction of PTSD symptoms, especially hyperarousal, avoidance, and numbing or dissociation. For example, the more miles biked in any given week resulted in greater reduction of symptoms overall. Similarly, physical activity with moderate to vigorous intensity provided greater benefit than light to moderate intensity. Understanding this, clinicians can work with consumers to progressively increase activity, duration, and intensity over time to improve outcomes. Finally, sequencing of physical activity might also influence outcomes. For example, one study tested augmenting physical activity before and after sessions of prolonged exposure therapy and found that the group who engaged in physical activity after sessions experienced larger reduction in symptoms. So it is recommended that clinicians work with consumers to consider some form of movement after psychotherapy sessions to help regulate and ground their central nervous systems. There are a number of risks and barriers as well as limitations in this project, including the reality that physical activity can pose a risk to the health of individuals if they push too hard or overexert themselves. I'm sure some of us have experienced that before. Some consumers also have limited experience and or exposure to various forms of physical activity, so there may be a knowledge and confidence deficit. And some consumers also bring negative associations or experiences with physical activity, so finding something they can enjoy may take some time. And finally, some consumers do live with physical disabilities that make activity of this kind a challenge. However, the underlying mechanisms of change likely apply even to the smallest of movements. So while this is an exciting and growing body of literature in the treatment of PTSD, more research is needed to deepen our understanding of the mechanisms of change, populations for whom this works best, and timing and duration of these interventions. However, it is clear that physical activity is a promising, accessible, and relatively low-cost intervention that can be a powerful tool for clinicians and consumers to use for mind and body in the treatment of PTSD. Thank you. And our next presenter is Karen Eke.
Okay, so my name is Karen Eke, and my project is Collective Care, reflective group supervision to build, can y'all hear me? Reflective group supervision to build resilience in MSW students. So this grew out first from my experiences in my field placements. My first year, I got to participate in wonderful group supervision with my mentor and so many veteran social workers, and I got to see them mutually process what they were going through, share resources, and really dig into each other's knowledge and support each other. And then in my second year, I had the great fortune to be a part of a training cohort of psychology interns, counseling interns, other social workers, and I got so much out of that. That is so much a part of why I know I will be a good social worker going forward. We got feedback from each other. We shared support. I deepened my practice because of supervision. And when I saw the other people in my classes, I noticed that that was a thing that they were missing. The ability to share support, the ability to lean on each other and to learn from each other inside the classroom. As such, I think that group supervision is a wonderful way to reduce burnout and to grow support between students. And I think it's also a way for all of us to invest in collective care. Just the idea that, and I'll use the quote, the separation of the person from the collective, as well as the separation of the personal from the professional, is conceptual, not factual. The idea that we are separate from the work that we do, or that we can take ourselves away from the collective that we are a part of, I think is more of a concept, but in reality, we're one and the same. We bring ourselves wherever we go. So for the purposes of my project, burnout is being defined as, or characterized by, emotional exhaustion, lack of personal self-efficacy, and depersonalization, just that feeling, that overall feeling of, I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I'm ready for what awaits me at work. And the demand support control model was also really important for me because it shows that when in professions like social work that have a high amount of demand, where student interns have very little control over the work that they do, and when that is met with very little support, that really that contributes to worker stress and depression. So my solution to this is the implementation of reflective group supervision in field education courses. This is based on the theoretical approach of relational cultural theory, just the idea that growth fostering relationships are sources of mutual support and empathy. The idea that we learn best together and we heal best together. So the idea is building into and leading on those relationships to grow and support each other. This would happen ideally in the field education classroom because that's already the setting where we learn so much about field education. That would be the best place to implement this. And also as a part of that curriculum, I would recommend mindfulness-based stress reduction coursework. I think the idea that we support each other and we use proven practices to help reduce the stress that we feel in our field placements. I found a lot of great research for this that I'll dig into more when you come to my poster, but I found that providers who were able to participate in group supervision found that they were able to give meaningful growth promoting, and feedback to each other, which is transferable to other settings. Those who were able to engage in reflective supervision reported feeling supported and restored, enabled, empowered, and having a sense of agency. We know the benefits of mindfulness, that it helps to lower the risk of secondary traumatic stress and compassion fatigue and burnout, and it is also positively correlated to compassion satisfaction. And again, coming back to the idea of collective care, the opportunity to engage in collective care through community building, group therapy, and other forms of connection is essential to whole self-healing. There are obviously barriers to this. The idea of building vulnerability amongst a first year group of students who don't know each other is hard. It's going to take strategic norms and intentionality from the people who are leading that class, as well as their own personal practice of reflection being brought into that space. And then it will also require a mindset shift from self-care and what we as individuals can do to keep ourselves in the field and going strong, and what we all can do for each other, and how we are all responsible for each other's healing and growth in field placement and in this profession. But there are so many opportunities, the opportunities to mutually invest in each other, to be a part of each other's growth and well-being, as well as to create some authentic touch points between field instructors and students about the work that we're really doing. So that's it for my presentation. And next up, we have Brad Gowans.
Thank you. So the title of my presentation is an analysis of cost for children in therapeutic and residential out-of-home care for Wayne County. So I've been a caseworker and a supervisor for 6.5 years at Wayne County Children's Services. One of the things that I have identified as an increasing problem for our agency and other agencies like us who are funded by levies supported by residents of the county is that the rising cost to place a child, not just in foster care that is or foster homes that are licensed through our agency, but out-of-network care, therapeutic agencies, and residential placement. What I have also noticed is that since the passage of the Family First Prevention Services Act, which puts focus on early intervention, working with families, and also emphasizes the importance of placing children in relative and kinship homes whenever they are not able to remain in their home, that this is a big push in the state. It is a shift in culture and a shift in philosophy that has guided children's service agencies for a long time. However, as we are identifying, and I believe Wayne County does a wonderful job at identifying family members, relatives within the county and across the state. But what we have noticed is that while the heart and the intentions of the relatives are there, that they do want the placement of their kin, they lack the knowledge or the tools to be successful in understanding the trauma that these children have been through and understanding the behaviors that come along with this trauma. And so while Wayne County has been good at identifying relative and kinship placement, where we struggle, like many other counties, is that the disruption rate is still relatively high. And once a child disrupts from a kinship home, and with the limited number of agency licensed foster homes, our agency is forced to look at purchase care. And if we do if we look at the analysis of costs for a therapeutic foster home or residential placement, we find that in the fiscal year of 2021, just under $3.5 million, or 34% of our annual budget, was allocated towards out-of-network costs. In 2022, that cost went up, and the total amount of money spent was 37%. And so far, through 2023, we see that the numbers of bed days in a therapeutic foster home or residential placement are staying consistent with fiscal year 2022. We speculate that the cost will remain the same or increase over this year. So with a budget that is growing with a cost that is growing larger and a budget that is finite and set, I set out to kind of identify what I thought could be a help in maintaining placement of these children with their families. So what I propose as my recommended change is the creation of a new agency position. This is a position that would be a home-based, in-home support for relatives and kin. This would be a social worker licensed, ideally at the master's level, that they are trained in and understand trauma and how it impacts development and behaviors that come with trauma. This training that they have obtained, this education that they have obtained, what they do is they will take that and work as a support to relative and kinship homes. They are part of what they will do is provide linkage to resources within the community for services that are identified that would help. They're also available to coach the parent or the caregivers in real time when they are struggling with a crisis or an area where they are unfamiliar with. Another important component is that this in-home supportive service person would begin working with the caregivers prior to placement so that they could help lay a foundational education of trauma and give them a realistic idea of what to expect, and then be there to help coach them in real time as well. And then lastly, they would also attend school meetings, IEP meetings about behavior concerns with the caregivers to be, again, a resource and a support, because so often the education and the knowledge that we have about trauma does not translate across other systems. And so having someone educated in this area to help support the caregivers would ensure that the child is being represented fairly and advocated for. So short-term goals for this is to strengthen and empower kinship caregivers and reduce the disruption rate from kinship homes. The long-term goal, ideally, is to reduce the cost of purchase care for Wayne County Children's Services. And hopefully, by identifying and implementing this, we can, again, help these children reduce trauma points and complex trauma that they already have from being involved in our system, and help foster their growth and keep them in their community and in their schools together. Thank you. And next, I would like to introduce Ada Jackson.
Okay, so I am really nervous, even though I've practiced this a million times. So I work at Cuyahoga County Children's Services in the Sex Abuse Investigation Unit. However, in going to work, I noticed during the pandemic specifically, a lot of kids started staying in the building. I had no idea when I started this project in field, it was like the biggest onion. And as I start peeling off layers, I was like, oh, okay, this is serious. So like I said, I'm gonna discuss the placement crisis at Children's Services. Specifically, I work at the Jane Edna Hunter building, so that's what I witnessed every day. I did speak with, I don't know if anyone knows Attorney John Lawson. He's been with the agency forever. But I did speak with him, and he told me, I was like, how did we get here? Like, what was it like before the pandemic? And he went back to 1974. And children have been in the building since then, but they had the runaway shelter. So what I did was talk to other staff in the agency about like what's going on, why are there so many kids? Particularly what I noticed was that a lot of them were in the adolescent range and primarily African American. So something's up, something's not meshing. So in starting to ask questions, and I got, foster parents and networks are being unable to meet the behaviors of the kids. A lot of them have significant, aggressive, violent behavior issues and mental health issues. We talked about decreased bedding at the residential facility, and in the pandemic, one of the facilities completely closed. And so that was a barrier, as well as the decline in the community's resources. The effects from the pandemic in regards to placing was a lot of providers were not taking kids unless they got negative COVID results. So that included their length of stay at the agency. It appeared to me that the agency had a mass exodus of employees. I think the last number I heard was 220 was the highest, where we did not have employees. And when I say employees, that includes the staff that are supposed to be at the child care center to watch the children that are in agency custody seeking placement. What has happened now, as recently as Friday, they sent an email out that regular workers, such as myself, have to sit in the child care room for 2 hours to supervise the kids because we just don't have the staff. And the demand, we're not meeting the need of the demand. As well as structural change. I don't know anybody has been to Jane Edna recently. There are now security locks, buzzes. You have to buzz in and out of every door. They have scanners in the front and in the back. It almost looks like a mini detention center. And that was not the purpose of Jane Edna. It was to be a resource center for families, not a mini DH. So some interventions that the agency has put in place in regards to this crisis that I would say went on an uptick at the height of the pandemic, was they have a partnership with Cleveland Christian Home for the T-suites. However, those beds are roughly 8 to 10 and they maxed out relatively quickly. They also have a partnership with Family First Center, which comes and transports the kids to their facility, and then they bring them back to the building, but they are getting day programming there. Continuous recruitment efforts for foster parents, adoptive parents. I also think that kinship needs to be maybe revamped because a lot of parents with the cost of living increase cannot afford to care for an additional kid no matter how bad they want to. They do have the kinship dollars, but it does not seem like a sufficient amount of money to ask a family member to take on an extra person or two, especially siblings. They did create we call it Kids in the Building. We do have a Kids in the Building protocol, and I also put providing funding timely to providers because as I was doing this is like a continuing situation. A lot of articles have come out in Cleveland.com regarding this, so I'd had no idea how massive this was. So I often ask questions about the agency ongoing plan to reduce the length of stay of kids in the building. And there's minimum talk, and this is just me as the worker and looking at this from the Juvenile Justice Center. A lot of times if kids are involved, they'll give us what we call an intent to grant, and I can explain that later when you come over. But I asked, what is the Justice Center doing to help the agency alleviate some of these issues that they have with kids in the building? So I do have data. What I discovered in the midst of all this is how policy as the worker impacted my field. So I had to go through a lot of protocol that I was not aware of to get the data, because the agency has a policy that is a records request. So any data that I have, I had to get approval from the agency, and then we didn't have it electronically, so I only have a hard copy, and it could not be meshed on the PowerPoint because it was a PDF, and you can't extrapolate a PDF and put it on there. So I do have the data. So that big blank right there is where the data is supposed to be that I have right here. So if you come over, you'll be able to see the data that supports my observation of kids being in the building, specifically the adolescent teenage group that are in the building. So I do have that data. So yeah, just what's the ongoing, so the current plan, like I said, that they do have the T-suites and they do have the partnership with them. And then just the agency is continuing ongoing efforts, because this is a moving train that's going really fast, and the negative input from the media is not helping us to even alleviate a lot of these goals. So I encourage everyone to inquire about foster care, adoption, kinship, placement, and things of that nature. So that is the youth crisis placement in the agency. And next up is Michaela Jackson Smith.
Good evening. My capstone is entitled Sensing Our Way to Healing, Incorporation of Sensory-Based Approaches into Youth Residential Treatment. So before I formally begin, I would just like to invite you to turn your attention inward towards your own breath. And if you find it being shallow, I encourage you to just maybe deepen it into the belly as I give you this presentation. And hopefully it will become clear why I suggest this. So just to start with a few statistics that really indicate how much our youth are suffering today, as you've heard from some of my colleagues. 1 in 3 adolescents report persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness. 1 in 3. And 1 in 5 have seriously considered suicide. In residential treatment, we are working with those ones, right? Many of them have experienced mental and behavioral health issues that are disproportionate from the broader population. In addition, there are disproportionate trauma histories in this population. 92% of youth in residential care with trauma history, which is the majority of youth in residential, have experienced multiple traumatic events, which classifies as complex trauma. Now, the interesting thing is that oftentimes these traumatic symptoms that are directly tied to these chronic toxic stressors in their lives do not necessarily rise to meet the level of diagnosable PTSD. But what we're maybe missing without this reaching the diagnosable PTSD that is the only trauma diagnosis we currently have is the fact that many of the behaviors we see are actually surface level manifestations of a more deeply rooted issue. A neurodevelopmentally informed trauma lens helps us contextualize behaviors like suicidality, self-injury, aggression, impulsivity, substance abuse, and the list goes on. And it helps us to understand where we can actually target our efforts. So just to give you a little bit of background about how trauma impacts the brain, it does depend on when these traumatic events happen throughout development. In the earliest years, traumatic events impact the lowest regions of the brain, and they then result in a disorganization that makes the development of the higher regions of the brain responsible for thinking and using your cognition also potentially impacted. It then also, when chronic toxic stressors occur over time without sufficient time between those stressors for the system to return to baseline, it results in sensitization of the stress response system. So when you have the stress response sensitization, then any time that stressors, novelty, or evocative cues that are reminiscent of traumatic stimuli are introduced to the system, it flips the lid or takes away the cognitive availability. Now, why does this matter to us? Majority of the evidence-based practices with the widest research bases that are used in residential treatment and in general with youth today are cognitive-based, language-dominant treatments. So for these treatments to actually be effective, it requires this cognitive access to your thinking brain. So if your lid is flipped and you're highly dysregulated, how do we expect the content to actually go in? So I have a proposal, and my proposal is to directly target the dysregulation in the lower regions of the brain, targeting the nervous system through sensory-based approaches. What are sensory-based approaches? I have categorized them into 6 categories, including movement, rhythm, sound, touch and pressure, sights, tastes and smells, and breath or vibration. So by using more of these approaches, we can increase clients' own embodied capacity for self-regulation and thereby increase their cognitive availability, which will then increase the effectiveness of these evidence-based approaches like cognitive behavior therapy, psychoeducation, dialectical behavior therapy, et cetera. So these can be, I've proposed a few practice innovations as to how these approaches can be incorporated into residential treatment. And first and foremost, it is to help individual clients identify the somatosensory needs that are individual to them, as well as the approaches and techniques and equipment that works for them. This should be highly individualized and encouraging autonomy over this discovery process. Then we can also incorporate these approaches into individual therapy sessions, as well as group treatment, where we're dealing with groups of dysregulated youth and the emotional contagion of that. And we can then also incorporate it into transitions within the treatment milieu. We know for young people developing brains, transitions are inherently difficult, and especially when we're dealing with the sensitization in the stress response system. These approaches could be anything from jumping on a mini trampoline, doing yoga, kinesthetic activity, diaphragmatic breathing, as I recommended earlier. And I have a lot more examples I would love to share. And I think it's really interesting to highlight that many of these approaches may look like play, and they also may be reminiscent of practices that have been used for centuries by Black and Indigenous cultures as well as other cultures around the world. And that provides a plethora of data that we should really take seriously. It is, anecdotal data, but it's meaningful. Now, the research does show and support that these approaches can reduce the use of re-traumatizing practices that have traditionally been used for behavior management in these settings, such as restraints and seclusion. It can increase both the felt sense of safety and safe behaviors. It can increase body awareness, the capacity for attachment, and the capacity for connection, among other things. And so, while these results are really promising, there is a lack of evidentiary research, a lot of explanatory and anecdotal research, so more is needed in this area to prove what is experientially known. And lastly, I really don't want to overstate the significance of what I'm telling you today. I am just graduating. But I do humbly ask you to just consider youth residential treatment as a microcosm for all settings in which we work with our highest need, most vulnerable populations who have experienced complex trauma at the hands of the systems and individuals meant to care for them. As social workers, it is our duty to find alternatives to approaches that are antithetical to everything we know about healing. Healing requires relationship, it requires community, safety, and self-efficacy. Isolating, restraining, and locking away people will only perpetuate intergenerational cycles of harm. And I am confident that using more of these approaches will help people gain an embodied sense of self-efficacy that is required for not only individual, but also intergenerational healing. Thank you. Oh, wrong way. Oh, no, right way. Sorry. Okay, great. And next up is Anna Kleige.
All right. My capstone is Under Pressure, an intervention for parents with teenagers in high-achieving schools. So I just want to start by getting us into the mindset of these students who attend high-achieving schools by reading you off some quotes from sessions we've had together. I had an 8th grader come into my office the other day, plop down on my couch, and tell me, I'm falling behind. I don't even know what my top college choice is. I hear comments like, I'm only as good as my test scores, or who am I if I'm not a good skater, all the time. And one of the most concerning comments that I've heard was, I can't take time to have friends. Everyone else will be working harder when I am, just hanging out with people? I need to just focus on being the best. So I started researching students who attend these high-achieving schools, and I found that they're actually a high-risk population. They have higher rates of internalizing problems like anxiety and depression, as well as externalizing problems like substance and alcohol abuse, as well as non-suicidal self-injury. And so I was really wondering, why? Why are these students who are attending these supposedly amazing schools at high risk? And through the literature, I found 6 different reasons for why. So these students experience an immense amount of achievement pressure, along with parental criticism. Then, when these students are isolated from their parents and have limited after-school supervision, they are more likely to have adverse outcomes. When we think about the substance use component of this, when parents are more relaxed around their teen's substance use, their kids are more likely to use and then develop problems later in life. And lastly, with social comparison, we see that individuals and families who are engaging more and more in social comparison, and think about social media and how much we compare ourselves, right? Those individuals are more likely to have adverse outcomes as well. And so I noticed this thread of that many of these reasons why connect back to things that parents could have control over. So I wanted to conceptualize an intervention that I could bring into my practice at a private practice that I was working through in my field experience, and provide some additional support for these students attending high-achieving schools. And so what I came up with was an intervention that spanned the course of 6 months. And parents would meet 3 times in a group setting and get both psychoeducation as well as skill-building exercises. And there are going to be 8 targets in this intervention. And these 8 targets are really coming out of the literature of what can help reduce high-achieving school student distress, as well as just looking at what bolsters these types of students. And so these 8 targets for the intervention include looking at parental well-being, so developing parents' own sense of self-care, de-emphasizing achievements in the home, focusing on building positive relationships with their teens, being a good role model for your kids, and what does that even look like? Developing social emotional skills along with communication skills, setting appropriate limits around substance and alcohol use within the home, and learning how to be vigilant for distress within their teens. And so why this intervention is an innovation is because what is currently being offered for these students is not only minimal at best, but could actually be harmful. And so right now, the interventions that are being provided these students include things like growth mindset, having an internal locus of control, or having some like good old-fashioned grit. And so none of these things are inherently negative, and they've actually been very helpful for some students. However, for these students, they are already working to their absolute maximum capacity. And then the intervention we're providing them is like, hey, just work a little bit harder and then you'll succeed. So we can see the danger in that. But there's also the other component of like, we're setting them up for a false reality, because many of these students can work as hard as they possibly can in the most difficult of classes and in all the extracurriculars that they can imagine. But when they're applying to a college, they can still be rejected despite all of that hard work. So what I've seen in practice is that we're setting them up for this crisis. And because we're telling them, you didn't get it because you didn't work hard enough. And what I see, not only are all of those mental health consequences we talked about at the beginning, but also just that their self-worth plummets because it was all because they didn't do something right. And so this intervention, I hope, is better than this because it's targeting the root causes of why these students are experiencing distress. And it's meant to create family change. So we're looking to create like environmental and attitudinal changes within the home to hopefully create innate capacities for these students. Because the reality is they're going on to high achieving colleges that are going to be high pressure. And then they're going into work environments that are going to continue to have high pressure. So it's really important that we're building these innate capacities. So I want to leave you with this. I have been going through the termination process with all of my clients, and part of that has been asking them what growth they've seen throughout their time in therapy. And I think one of my clients, who is a high-achieving school student, really got to the core of what this intervention is aiming to do. So when I asked like what growth they've seen in themselves throughout therapy, they shared with me, you know what? I think I finally realized that I am enough. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. All right, up next we have Jessica Mergel.
Okay, Madam President. Oh boy. I was waiting for that. All right. You're in for a bit of a topic shift, so just prepare yourself. The title of my capstone is More Than Shelter, The Benefits and Challenges of Diversion. So first I want to lay the groundwork a little bit for how and why diversion programs have emerged in this country. So one, we know that there are disproportionate rates of mental health and substance use and trauma histories among our folks who are incarcerated across the U.S. And as such, jails and prisons have become the de facto behavioral health treatment facilities for adults. Recognizing that these are insufficient sites of treatment, in addition to a multitude of socio-political factors, such as deaths associated with the opioid crisis, as well as rising rates of incarceration over the last several decades, there's been a growing need and call for alternatives. One of the ways that this is manifested is in diversion programs. Across the U.S., the total count of programs is unknown, though it is upwards of over 600. The services provided, client population, and timing all vary as they've really grown out of an organic local community need. And one of those programs is right here in Cuyahoga County. I've had the pleasure of spending my last year doing my field placement there at Cuyahoga County Diversion Center, and I've really gotten an inside look into how we implement practices there. As it stands, the research is limited. Here and nationally, the implementation has really outpaced our research. And so what we know so far has really centered on this site of referral. So if you look at that sequence of care, we know a lot more about referral around diversion eligibility, so whether or not clients are eligible to be diverted away from arrest and jail, but not so much from the rest. And if you see from intake to linkage, that's all what happens within diversion centers themselves. So that's what I was really curious about, how we could really grow the evidence based around that. So we're following best practices and really growing our understanding of what works for clients. In particular, I'm curious about the linkage piece because our client population is really high need, both in behavioral health needs as well as having really limited access to basic needs such as housing. We know that linkage is really critical to ensuring that they're getting the care and support that they need out in the community, given that diversion programs like ours are short-term stay. So in terms of findings, I'd like to focus on two right now, but feel free to come to my poster and I'll talk to you more. The two I'd like to focus on are community partnerships and integrated treatment. Through my observations and research and interviews, I found that community partnerships are really essential to the success of diversion programs, both as sources of referral, so referring to diversion centers, but also for community linkage, right? So we need to have a healthy and robust behavioral health landscape in order for our clients to get the mental health, substance use, et cetera, treatment that they need once being discharged from diversion programs. And related to that, integrated treatment is really essential so that we're not separating out mental health and substance use. And we're also providing things like medication-assisted treatment, especially for things like high-risk opiate users. So moving on to recommendations, I first want to just state that diversion itself as a practice is innovative. There are amendments and recommendations we can start to follow in order to better serve our client population, but this is itself a new practice. The four that I've really kind of determined have to do with time, linkage, community, and research. So I think in terms of time, really increasing that allotted length of stay that clients are allowed in a short-term stay can really increase the rate of successful community linkage. Again, these are clients with really significant and chronic needs, and developing more formal and robust partnerships can allow for successful community linkage. The folks are getting the care that they need out in the community. And in order to mitigate that drop-off that sometimes occurs after discharge and between successful service provision, we can employ folks like peer support specialists out in the community to do research so we can help address those gaps. And finally, more research is needed, both here and nationally, and something that really prioritizes the client voice so that we can help address those gaps that are occurring. To close, almost there. I'd like to bring your attention to the fact that incarcerated individuals have an average of 5 adverse childhood experiences. That's in comparison to the general population, 60% of whom have experienced 1 in their lifetime. This is a client population that has experienced significant interpersonal, systemic, and historical trauma, and has experienced the compounding effects of those over the span of decades. They have not only been neglected and overlooked, but they have been harmed and punished. We as social workers and as a profession attuned to the impact of the environment on the person, not only have the duty, but the power to break those cycles of harm and trauma, and instead rebuild and reimagine systems of care that provide treatment, services, and support to clients we know that they're deserving of. Thank you. The next and final speaker is Garrett Wheeler.
All right, can you hear me all right? Okay. So for my Capstone project, I looked at the impact of mentorship programs. This topic grew out of involvement with College Now. As an intern at Beachbrook, I provide mental health services to young adults who participated in College Now's mentoring program. College Now is the oldest and largest college access organization in Ohio. And in 2011, College Now developed a mentorship program to improve college completion rates. Despite the program's success, College Now would like to see more students attend and graduate from college. After speaking with the senior director of College Now's mentoring program, I was asked to provide information to help answer key questions. 1, What factors should be considered when pairing mentors with mentees? 2, at what point in college does mentoring have the most impact? 3, is peer mentoring more beneficial than other types of mentoring? And 4, what guidelines should be implemented to foster communication? With regards to the first question, matching mentors and mentees based on certain personality characteristics increased psychosocial support received. These qualities include openness to experience, conscientiousness, and emotional intelligence. Openness to experience refers to intellectual curiosity and sensitivity. When mentors scored high in openness to experience, mentees reap the most benefits. Conscientiousness relates to self-discipline, organization, and persistence. Congruence and conscientiousness improved relationship outcomes. And emotional intelligence is the ability to perceive, understand, regulate, and express emotions. Mentors with high emotional intelligence were better able to establish trust with mentees, which positively affected the quality of mentoring. And another factor to consider is the commitment level of mentors. Organizations can improve the commitment of mentors by setting clear expectations, providing mentors with pre-match training, and considering mentors' preferences in selecting mentee. In terms of timing and impact, mentoring was most beneficial for first-year students. The transition to college is particularly challenging as students must adjust to a completely new environment. Support for first-year students should focus on mental well-being. For those getting ready to graduate, however, career development is more applicable. I also reviewed a study which examined timing and impact of different types of mentors on academic success. Mentors were categorized according to their affiliation to mentees, so community mentors, teacher mentors, friend mentors, and kin mentors. Teacher mentors had the most impact on educational attainment of adult mentees, and community mentors were most influential during childhood and early adolescence. Peer mentoring is supported by student integration theory, which suggests that students are less likely to drop out when they're involved on campus. Peer mentors are best suited to facilitate social integration. Nevertheless, peer mentoring produced inconsistent results with regards to grades and college withdrawal. First-year college students who participated in peer mentoring programs had slightly higher GPAs than control groups. In addition, those who participated in peer mentoring were more likely to return the following semester. These findings, however, were not statistically significant, and the effects of peer mentoring diminished after the first year of college. With regards to communication guidelines, I was unable to find much information. This may be due to the proprietary nature of mentoring curricula. It is evident, however, that time spent between dyads improves outcomes. In general, research on mentoring is complicated by inconsistent definitions of mentoring. Further, studies on the subject often lack scientific rigor. Despite these shortcomings, research on mentoring is becoming more prevalent. I think that individuals are starting to appreciate the value of mentoring, and I'm sure that we have all, at some point, benefited from the support of a trusted mentor. This concludes the live stream portion of the Capstone presentations. The fellows would like to thank all of you for attending and express our appreciation to the faculty, field supervisors, staff, and mentors who have helped us along our journey. The Leadership Fellows would also like to acknowledge the Mandel Foundation for its generous support of the Mandel Leadership Fellows program. We'll now transition to the live poster session and look forward to speaking more in depth with you about our Capstone projects.